He was a man of God, respected, revered, and feared in equal measure. For 30 years, Pastor Ezekiel Graves preached about sin, salvation, and the sacred bond between father and son. But on a quiet spring morning in Alabama, he married a woman no one truly knew. She was young, beautiful, and hiding a scar that would unravel everything he thought was holy. Because after the wedding night, he saw it. A crescent-shaped scar he'd kissed 2 decades earlier on the back of a boy who vanished without a trace. DNA confirmed the impossible. His new bride was his missing son, and days later, in a church soaked with rain and silence, Pastor Graves crucified the truth in the most unholy way imaginable. This is the story of love, delusion, faith, and murder. And what happens when your past doesn't just return. It walks down the aisle in a wedding dress. The wedding was beautiful, eerily so. The Alabama sun bathed the white chapel in gold, and the choir sang with a kind of trembling reverence, like they too were unsure what to make of what was happening. Pastor Ezekiel Graves, a 58-year-old man of towering sermons and iron convictions, was marrying a woman half his age. Her name was Mirabelle, 29, mysterious. Radiant point. One woman in the back pew didn't clap when the vows ended. Her name was Sister Laureen Wallace, a longtime member of the church, widowed, stone-faced, and known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. She'd seen every new face in Demopolis since 1973, and she wasn't buying this one. As Mirabelle stood at the altar, glowing under the sunlight that bled through stained glass, Laureen leaned toward the younger woman beside her and whispered, "That girl's hiding something. I can feel in my bones." The younger woman smiled awkwardly, brushing it off. But Laureen didn't smile. Her eyes stayed locked on Mirabelle's back. Later, she'd swear she saw something move beneath that white dress. Something off. But she kept quiet. After all, who questions love at the altar? And until 3 months ago, no one in the small town of Demopolis had even heard her name. But Ezekiel was glowing, more alive than he'd been in years. After decades preaching about sin, salvation, and the second coming of Christ, he told his congregation that he had finally received his own miracle, love. Not just any love, but a divine match, blessed by the Lord himself. Some believed him. Most did not. There was something off from the beginning. Whispers crept through the pews like snakes in the grass. She's too young. Where's her family? Didn't he say he never got over Joshua? People remembered the son Ezekiel lost 20 years ago. A 10-year-old boy with big eyes and a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon behind his left shoulder. Disappeared without a trace. The police searched for weeks. The church held vigils. But the boy was never found, and the pastor had carried that cross with him ever since. Still, there he was smiling, holding Mirabelle's hand at the altar like he'd never known pain. Like this wasn't a complete betrayal of his own grief. Mirabelle, for her part, seemed almost ethereal. She had a softness to her face that blurred age, a gentleness that both soothed and unsettled. She cried during the vows, but didn't speak much otherwise. Her past was a mystery, even to the women in the congregation who'd tried to get to know her. The only thing she ever said was that she'd been through darkness and found peace in the pastor's sermons. It was easy to romanticize until the night fell. The reception was modest. Lemonade, hymns on acoustic guitar, and a homemade cake shaped like a Bible. But Ezekiel left early, barely saying goodbye to the last of his guests. He held Mirabelle's hand tightly as they walked to the parsonage, a house filled with framed scriptures, dusty books, and photos of a boy who never came home. That night, the town slept, satisfied they had witnessed something rare, a holy man finding happiness again. But inside the bedroom of the parsonage, Pastor Ezekiel Graves was unraveling. At first, it was soft, awkward kisses, nervous laughter. Mirabelle's hands trembled slightly, and Ezekiel, sensing her unease, whispered scripture into her ear. Perfect love casts out fear. Then came the moment that would change everything. As he undressed her, his eyes fell on her back. Just below the shoulder blade, a scar. Faint, curved, the shape of a crescent moon. He froze. Mirabelle tensed, pulled away slightly, then whispered, "It's just an old scar. Childhood accident." But Ezekiel didn't answer. He couldn't, because he had seen that scar before, kissed it, in fact, when it bled and the boy screamed in his arms. Joshua had fallen from a tree at age 6 and sliced his back open on a broken fence. The doctors stitched it. The mark never faded. Ezekiel's hands began to tremble. He reached out again, gently tracing the scar with 2 fingers, trying to convince himself that it wasn't what he knew it was, that it was coincidence, a trick of the light, maybe the mind playing games. But his body didn't lie. He pulled away from her without a word and walked into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. For 30 minutes, he sat on the toilet lid, breathing hard, sweat pouring from his brow. He stared at himself in the mirror, aged and pale, a man of God caught in a silent scream. When he emerged, Mirabelle was asleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at her face in the moonlight. He wanted to believe this was just the devil, a test, a cruel illusion meant to shatter the peace he'd finally found. But something deeper had been disturbed, something ancient, primal, and terrifying. Because if what he saw was real, then he had just married his own son. And worse, he had just touched him in a way no father ever. The town still remembered the flyers. Joshua Elijah Graves, age 10, missing since October 14th, 2005. The photo showed a bright-eyed boy with gap teeth, dimples, and skin just a few shades lighter than his father's. He was wearing a red t-shirt with "Jesus Loves Me" printed in cracked white letters. Every grocery store, gas station, and telephone pole in Marengo County had that same photo taped to it, until the rain washed it away and the hope went with it. Ezekiel had just come home from a Wednesday night sermon when he noticed Joshua wasn't in his usual spot on the porch. At first, he wasn't worried. Kids wander. Boys chase frogs or get caught up in a neighbor's treehouse. But the sun went down, and Joshua didn't come in. The search started before midnight. The entire congregation showed up with flashlights and prayers. The sheriff brought dogs. The riverbanks were combed. Swamps drained. Ezekiel walked for 3 days straight without sleep, calling his son's name into the pines like some desperate prophet. No signs, no clothes, no blood, just an empty swing in the backyard that creaked in the breeze. Ezekiel's wife, Angela, never recovered. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping. She sat in Joshua's room every night, sometimes talking to his toys as if they might answer. Within a year, cancer came, and Ezekiel liked to believe she died from that. But he knew better. She died from absence, from silence, from having a son one day and a ghost the next. They buried an empty casket, just a stone with his name carved on it, beside a verse Angela had chosen. "For the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." People said Ezekiel took it well. He didn't scream or curse God. He didn't leave the ministry. In fact, he threw himself deeper into the word, started preaching harder, longer, louder, told the congregation that grief was a fire that refined the soul. That pain was proof of faith. But behind the pulpit, in the privacy of his parsonage, Ezekiel cracked. There were nights he'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced he'd heard Joshua's voice in the hallway. He once tore apart the crawl space under the house, sure he'd find a body there. When that yielded nothing, he started fasting for days, thinking maybe God would reward his sacrifice with a vision. No vision came, just the slow decay of sanity. At one point, he kept a drawer full of letters he never sent, addressed to Joshua, full of apologies, confessions, and birthday wishes. Every October 14th, he'd drive to the same stretch of woods where Joshua was last seen and leave a small wooden cross in the soil. People stopped asking after the 5th year. The sheriff quietly marked the case as inactive. No body, no suspects, no leads. Just another Alabama mystery. Then one Sunday, Ezekiel declared in front of his congregation that the Lord told me Joshua is with him now. He wept from the pulpit for the first time. That day, something shifted. He stopped bringing up Joshua in his sermons, stopped mentioning Angela. He painted over the murals in Joshua's room, replaced the photos on the mantle with portraits of saints and church elders. It was as if he decided, if he couldn't have answers, he'd settle for erasure. And for over a decade, it worked. He became a pillar of strength in the community, a symbol of endurance. Young preachers came to him for counsel. Women in grief looked to him as proof they could survive. No one saw the man who still flinched when he saw a 10-year-old boy with curly hair. No one saw the way he gripped his Bible too hard when someone mentioned missing children. By 2020, Ezekiel had made peace with the loss, or at least buried it deep enough to breathe again. He started a new sermon series called The Lord Restores. He even smiled more, laughed sometimes, and when a quiet, beautiful woman named Mirabelle showed up in the back pew one Sunday in spring, he felt something stir in him he hadn't known in years. He thought it was resurrection. He thought it was grace. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't imagine, was that grace sometimes wears a mask. That resurrection, when it comes, doesn't always look like a miracle. Sometimes it looks like a scar. The sheets were white, clean, tightly tucked, like hospital linen. Pastor Ezekiel Graves had never imagined his second wedding night would feel this clinical. He sat on the edge of the bed, shirt unbuttoned, hands folded as if in prayer, watching Mirabelle brush her hair in the vanity mirror. Her back was to him, smooth, graceful, calm. She hummed a tune he didn't recognize. "I've waited for this," she said softly, "for someone to see me, really see me." Ezekiel tried to smile, but it felt stiff. His jaw had been tight all day. He chalked it up to nerves. What man wouldn't feel strange marrying a woman 30 years younger? And yet there was something else, something deeper, something he didn't dare name. Mirabelle turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, almost childlike, and her lips curled into a hesitant smile. She climbed onto the bed beside him, placing a hand gently on his chest. He flinched, not enough for her to notice, but enough that he noticed. "Are you afraid?" she asked. "No," he lied. "Just out of practice." They kissed. It was slow, uncertain. His hands ran over her shoulders, her waist, her hips. And just as he began to pull her closer, she tensed. "Wait," she said, barely a whisper. "Can you turn off the light?" Ezekiel paused. "Why? I just feel safer that way." He obliged. The bedside lamp clicked off, and the room dimmed to a soft, bluish hue lit only by the moon outside. As his eyes adjusted, he traced her silhouette. She was beautiful, no question, but there was something familiar. They resumed, her body warm against his, breaths quickening. But as he ran his hand along her back, his fingers brushed a patch of raised skin. His heart stopped. He gently pulled back and whispered, "What's this?" "Just a scar," she replied too quickly. "From when I was little." He sat up, blood draining from his face. His fingers returned to the spot, left shoulder blade just beneath the bone. He didn't need light to know what he was feeling. A crescent-shaped scar. His body stiffened. His chest throbbed as if someone had slammed a Bible into it. That scar, that exact shape, that exact position. He had kissed it 1,000 times when Joshua was a boy. After the tree fall, after the ER, after the stitches, it had become a part of Joshua. And now it was here, on Mirabelle. He stood up, breathing hard. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in like judgment. Mirabelle sat up, sheets clutched her chest. "Ezekiel," she asked, her voice small. He didn't respond. He walked to the bathroom, shut the door, and locked it with shaking hands. Then he turned on the light and looked in the mirror. His face was ghostly, pale, eyes sunken. No, it's not possible. That's not Joshua. That's not your son. It's a coincidence, a mistake, a hallucination. But the voice in his head wouldn't let up. "You saw the scar. You know it. You raised it. You buried it. And now it's back in your bed." He sat on the toilet, head in hands. He tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Only images, flashbacks of Joshua at age 10, climbing trees barefoot. Joshua crying in his arms after falling. Joshua's blood on his church shirt. The smell of antiseptic. The quiet hum of a hospital machine. And now Mirabelle. Same scar. Same birthmark. Same feel under his fingertips. He stayed in the bathroom for nearly 40 minutes. When he emerged, Mirabelle was asleep, her breathing steady and light. She looked peaceful, innocent, like nothing had happened. But for Ezekiel, something had happened. A door had opened inside him, and behind it, something monstrous waited. He sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her, trying to reconcile the impossible. If she was Joshua, if this was his son, then what had he just done? And if she wasn't, why did it feel like every nerve in his body was screaming liar? He didn't sleep that night. He just sat there, in the dark, hands clasped tight, rocking back and forth like a man who knew hell was coming, and still couldn't look away. The morning after the wedding, Pastor Ezekiel Graves stood in the kitchen pouring coffee with hands that refused to stop trembling. Mirabelle was still asleep upstairs, her arm casually draped across the empty space where he should have been. He stared out the window into the misty yard where the old tire swing still creaked in the wind, a relic of the boy who once lived here. Joshua. The scar hadn't been a coincidence. He knew that now. He'd traced it with the same calloused fingers 20 years ago. A father doesn't forget the shape of his child's pain. And yet, that scar now lived on the back of his wife. It didn't make sense. It couldn't, but it did. Ezekiel tried reading scripture that morning, flipping randomly through Psalms, Romans, Job, anything to anchor him. But the words on the page were blurred by cold sweat and dread. By noon, he had made up his mind. He waited until Mirabelle stepped into the shower. She sang softly, the way children hum when they're lost in their own world. Ezekiel slipped into the bedroom, opened her purse, and found a comb tangled with strands of her dark brown hair. He plucked 3 of them, wrapped them carefully in tissue, then placed them in a Ziploc bag. The next day, he drove 3 towns over to a private DNA testing clinic, far from the eyes of his congregation. He told the receptionist it was for a paternity clarification. The woman didn't ask questions. She handed him a form and took the bag without hesitation. "Results take about 5 business days," she said. "We'll call you." But Ezekiel already knew. Deep down, he knew. Those 5 days moved like a funeral march. He went through the motions, sermons, hospital visits, Wednesday Bible study, but his mind was never in the room. He started avoiding Mirabelle's gaze. Claimed exhaustion. Claimed prayer. She didn't press. She never did. That was part of what had drawn him to her. She didn't demand. But now he wished she would. He wished she'd confess. Explain. End this torment. Each night, he lay beside her, rigid, cold, staring at the ceiling while she slept with peaceful, slow breaths. He tried convincing himself this was a spiritual attack, that Satan was using his grief against him. Maybe he was being punished. Maybe this was his Abraham moment, God testing how far he'd go. But then Thursday came. The phone rang. The caller ID read, Genius Labs. Ezekiel answered with a whisper. Mr. Graves? Yes. We received your results. He didn't respond. The line went quiet for a second, as if even the woman on the other end was bracing for the weight of what she was about to say. There is a 99.97% probability that the sample provided is a biological match to the individual listed as the alleged parent. Ezekiel's heart slammed against his ribcage. You're saying, she's your biological child, sir. He didn't even say thank you. He just hung up. The receiver slipped from his hand and hit the floor. He stood there, frozen in the living room, surrounded by photos of baptisms and youth retreats and Easter Sunday choirs, walls covered in memories of a man of God. But now he couldn't even say his own name. His wife was his son. His wedding night had been incest. And everything, he believed in had cracked wide open. That night, he didn't eat. He didn't speak. He didn't even go upstairs. He sat alone in the parsonage study, staring at a faded photograph of Joshua, age 9, front teeth missing, holding a plastic dinosaur and grinning like the world had never heard him. Ezekiel looked at the eyes in that photo, then tried to recall Mirabelle's face. Same eyes, same mouth, even the way they furrowed their brow. When confused, it was all there. How had he not seen it sooner? By morning, he had only one option. He needed answers, not speculation, not silence. So when Mirabelle walked into the kitchen, still in her robe, smiling sleepily and asking if he wanted eggs, Ezekiel didn't answer. He just said, "Who are you?" She paused, the spatula in her hand hovering over the pan. "I'm your wife," she said, confused. "Mirabelle." He shook his head slowly. "No, you're not." Her smile faltered. She placed the spatula down. A long silence stretched between them. "You knew," he said, voice low. "Didn't you?" She didn't speak. "I ran your DNA," he continued. "You're my son." Mirabelle's face changed, not in shock, but in sorrow, like someone whose secret had finally arrived at its inevitable end. She nodded once, just once, and Ezekiel, who had buried a child 20 years ago, now stood face to face with that same soul, in a different body, a different name, and a different truth than anything he had ever prepared for. He stepped back like she'd struck him. And for the first time in his life, Ezekiel Graves, pastor of Mercy Way Baptist Church, felt something deeper than sin. He felt blasphemy, but not against God, against blood. Mirabelle didn't cry. That's the first thing Ezekiel noticed. She didn't scream, collapse, deny, or plead. She didn't even blink. She just stood there in the kitchen, her robe barely tied, the smell of eggs burning in the pan, and looked at him with eyes that once belonged to a boy named Joshua. "I knew you'd find out," she said softly. Ezekiel couldn't breathe. He backed into a chair and sat down like his legs no longer belonged to him. The world tilted, like gravity itself had betrayed him. His hands shook violently. He pressed his palms together and bowed his head, as if by some miracle of prayer, this could all be undone. How he whispered, "How is this even real?" Mirabelle turned off the stove. She moved with grace, like someone used to stepping through minefields. She sat across from him and folded her hands. "I was 10 when I left," she began. "I didn't run away because I hated you. I ran because I knew I didn't belong in that house and that body. I knew it even then." Ezekiel stared at her, eyes sunken, jaw clenched. "You were a child. My child. I was your child," she said. "But you only saw me as your son, never who I really was." He slammed his fist against the table. The wood cracked. "You were Joshua, my boy. I held you in the hospital. I taught you to read the word. You were supposed to be a man of God." Mirabelle didn't flinch. "I was dying in that body, Daddy. Every day. I would have rather disappeared than grow into someone I wasn't." The word daddy sent an electric jolt down his spine. He winced like she'd cursed him. "And so you did disappear," he said bitterly. "You left us. You left your mother. You let her die, wondering where you were." Mirabelle looked down. "I know, and I'll carry that forever. But if I had stayed, I don't think I would have lived long enough to see her die." Ezekiel stared at the scar again. That cursed, crescent-shaped scar just beneath her collarbone. The one he'd bandaged as a father, and now seen as a husband. He felt sick. "So you knew," he said through clenched teeth. "You knew who I was the entire time." She nodded. "I watched your sermons online for years," she said. "I never planned to come back. But then I saw you preach about restoration, about second chances. And I thought maybe you'd changed, that you'd finally be able to see me." He couldn't contain the rage anymore. He stood up abruptly, towering over her, veins bulging from his temples. "You seduced me. You made me touch you. You made me sin in a way no man should ever." "I didn't make you do anything," she said, her voice trembling now for the first time. "I just let you love me. You're my son." "I'm not your son," she snapped. "I haven't been for a long time." Silence. A long, cold, suffocating silence. He sat back down, broken now, head in his hands. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he whispered. She reached out, barely brushing his fingers. "You can forgive me. You can try. Or you can hate me. But I came back because I still loved you. Even after everything. Even knowing you'd rather see me dead than different." He didn't answer. Couldn't. Every cell in his body screamed confusion, disgust, longing, sorrow. For a brief second, he wanted to reach out and hold her. Not as Mirabelle, not even as Joshua, just as someone he once lost and now found again. But the weight of what had happened between them crushed that impulse before it could rise. Finally, she stood up. Her voice had gone soft again. "I can leave," she said. "If you want me to, I'll go." He didn't say no. He didn't say yes. He just sat there, staring down at his shaking hands, still hearing her voice echo in the hollow space between his ribs. "I just wanted to be seen," she said one last time, before walking upstairs. Ezekiel remained in that kitchen until the sun went down. His faith, his fatherhood, his manhood, all of it now tangled in one impossible, unbearable truth. He had married his child, and for one night, he had made love to a ghost. He stopped preaching. At first, the church thought it was grief, maybe illness. Pastor Graves had been through so much already, they said. A man like him deserved rest. But as the Sundays dragged on, 1, 2, then 3, and guest preachers filled the pulpit while Ezekiel stayed locked in the parsonage, rumors started to spread. Some said he was having a breakdown. Others whispered he had fallen into sin. No one guessed the truth. Ezekiel stopped shaving, stopped eating more than scraps of toast and instant coffee. The mirror became his enemy. His Bible, once worn from decades of sermon prep, now sat unopened on the nightstand like an unread indictment. He stopped sleeping in the bedroom. He couldn't. Not with that mattress. Not with those sheets. Not with the memory of his hands on skin that should have been sacred. Instead, he moved to the study, curling up in the same chair where he once read bedtime stories to Joshua. He hadn't called Mirabelle by that name since the confrontation. He hadn't called her anything at all. They didn't speak. She stayed upstairs, quietly packing her things into boxes. Some nights, he heard her crying through the vent. Other nights, he heard her praying. But never once did she try to come down. Never once did she knock. Ezekiel spent his days obsessing over Scripture, not to find comfort, but contradiction. He searched for proof that he'd been tricked, that this was a test, that this was the devil's work, that the flesh had deceived him and not the soul. But the verses no longer offered certainty. Worse, some of them accused him directly. "Woe unto him that calleth evil good. If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out, It will be better for him to have a millstone tied around his neck. He read them over and over until they blurred into one unending judgment. A voice louder than God's. A voice that sounded like his own. He started fasting, not out of piety, but penance. For days. No food, just water and prayer and silence. On the 5th, he whipped himself with a leather belt from his dead wife's Bible case. 15 lashes. One for every year Mirabelle had been missing. One for every year he hadn't searched harder. One for every hour he lay in bed with her, blind to the truth. On the 6th day, he walked to the church in the middle of the night. He didn't bring a key, just broke the side window and crawled through like a thief in his own house of worship. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The pulpit untouched, the cross illuminated by soft blue light, and the communion table still covered with a lace cloth Angela had crocheted before she died. He collapsed at the altar. He wept, not like a grieving father, but like a condemned man. Loud, guttural, ugly cries that shook the pews and echoed through the rafters. "Why me?" he screamed. "Why her? Why now? Why would you let this happen?" No answer came. Not from heaven. Not from within. He reached up to the cross, trembling fingers clutching its wooden base. He pressed his forehead to it, as if trying to bleed the madness from his skull into the symbol itself. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know." But a darker thought followed. And if you had known, would you still have loved her? That broke him, because the answer wasn't no. It wasn't yes either. It was worse. It was I don't know. He had lost the one thing he thought no one could take from him, his clarity, his moral compass, his ability to separate right from wrong, holy from profane. And in that absence, only rot remained. By morning, the church deacons found the sanctuary door wide open and Ezekiel curled up beneath the cross, barefoot and shivering, with dried blood caked on his back from fresh lashes. They called an ambulance. He refused to go. "I'm not sick," he told them. "I'm just waiting." "For what?" one asked. He looked up, eyes wild and empty. "For judgment." It happened on a Tuesday. The church was empty. Rain fell in long, silver threads against the stained glass windows, casting ripples of colored light across the altar. The pews were silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood and the distant rumble of thunder above. Ezekiel stood at the foot of the cross, staring up at the bleeding figure of Christ. His arms were outstretched, not in welcome, but in surrender. The Savior's face, carved by hand decades ago, wore an expression Ezekiel could no longer read. Was it mercy or judgment? He had been in the sanctuary since dawn, fasting, praying, pacing, waiting, and she came. Mirabelle entered through the side door, quietly, as if drawn not by decision but fate. She wore a simple black coat, no makeup, her hair pulled back. She carried nothing. They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound between them the soft drumming of rain on the rooftop. "I didn't think you'd come," Ezekiel said, his voice rasped from fasting. "I didn't plan to," Mirabelle replied, "but I saw the light was on." He turned toward her, slowly. His face looked older than it had days ago. Gaunt, gray, like something had already died inside him. "You shouldn't be here." She stepped forward anyway. One step, then another. Her voice was calm, but steady. "You said you wanted to talk." "No," he said. "I wanted to understand." "And did you?" He looked at her long and hard, his eyes scanning her face as if hoping to find the boy he'd lost somewhere beneath the woman she'd become. "I see him in you," he said finally. "In your eyes. In the way you breathe when you're nervous. I see my son." "I'm not your son," she whispered. He nodded. "And that's the sin, isn't it? Not the flesh. Not what we did. The sin was in not knowing, in loving blindly." Her jaw clenched. "That's not sin. That's being human." He stepped forward, voice rising. "No, It was blasphemy. Against God. Against blood. Against creation. Mirabelle's eyes welled, but she stood her ground. Then tell me this, Ezekiel, when you touched me, when you kissed me, when you held me that night, did you feel evil? He didn't answer. She continued. Because I didn't. I felt wanted. I felt whole. For the first time since I was 10 years old. He turned away sharply, walking toward the altar. His hands gripped its edge. I was a man of God, he said, and I laid with my own blood. You didn't know, but I do now. Lightning cracked through the windows. Thunder followed like a warning drum. Mirabelle took one more step forward, voice shaking now. I came back because I wanted you to see me. All of me. Not Joshua. Not the boy you lost. Not the child who vanished into silence. I came back because I wanted my father to know the woman I became. Ezekiel didn't move. I loved you, Daddy, she whispered. And I thought, maybe you still love me too. He turned then, slowly, something cold in his eyes. I did, he said. Mirabelle smiled faintly. For a split second, there was hope in the air, a soft light beneath the storm. But then he reached behind the altar and pulled out the ceremonial crossbar. It was heavy, oak, once used in Easter reenactments. Now a weapon. Mirabelle's smile vanished. Ezekiel, he walked toward her like a man possessed. I loved you, Mirabelle, he said. But love isn't greater than truth. And the truth is, this is unnatural. This is wrong. This is filth wearing the skin of my child. No, please. But it was too late. He raised the crossbar and brought it down with all the wrath of a broken prophet. The first blow struck her shoulder. She screamed, tried to run, slipped on the wet stone floor near the baptistry. The second cracked against her ribs. The third, her skull. Blood splattered across the communion table, onto the lace cloth Angela had once sewn. The stained glass windows turned crimson as the sun broke briefly through the clouds. And then silence. When Ezekiel stopped swinging, he dropped the crossbar with a thud that echoed through the rafters like a final amen. He stood over her, breath ragged, hands shaking. Her eyes were open. Still, he sank to his knees beside her, placed a trembling hand on her cheek. I'm sorry, he whispered, but you shouldn't have come back. He closed her eyes gently, then rose and walked back to the altar, blood on his hands, his shirt, his face. And for the first time in 40 years, he didn't pray. He simply looked up at the crucified figure above him and said, Your will is done. The headlines hit like a sledgehammer. Pastor marries trans woman, then kills her after discovering she's his son. Father, preacher, murderer. Alabama's faith turned upside down. Within hours, the story exploded nationwide. News trucks parked outside Mercy Way Baptist Church. Helicopters circled the tiny town of Demopolis, and internet sleuths dug up every trace of Mirabelle Graves' past. From her missing person report as Joshua Elijah Graves to the moment she changed her name legally 5 years earlier. The public was stunned, not just by the murder, but by the why. He didn't just kill his wife. He killed the child he thought had died 20 years ago, and she had returned as a woman. Ezekiel Graves was arrested at the altar, calmly sitting beneath the bloodstained cross. His hands were still red. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his wrist for the cuffs like he'd been waiting for them. The trial began the following spring. You couldn't get within 2 blocks of the courthouse without being swallowed by the chaos. Protesters lined the sidewalks, some waving rainbow flags and holding signs that read, Trans Lives Matter. Others stood across the street with Bibles and crosses, shouting, Repent. And this wasn't murder. It was justice. The courtroom itself was packed. National media, civil rights attorneys, evangelical leaders, trans activists, and average Americans who didn't know whether to cry or scream. The prosecution painted a clear, devastating picture. Mirabelle Graves was a survivor. She escaped abuse, lived in hiding, transitioned alone, and finally returned. Not for revenge, but to be seen, to be loved. She believed her father, a man of God, would finally accept her. Instead, he murdered her in cold blood, inside the very church where he once baptized her. They showed photos of the crime scene. Blood splattered across the communion table. A wooden crossbar snapped in half. Her body, broken beneath a stained glass window that once read, "Come as you are." And the final detail, she never fought back. She trusted him. The defense, meanwhile, took a different route. They argued mental collapse, that Ezekiel had been deceived in the most horrifying way imaginable, that he had accidentally committed incest, and when faced with the truth, suffered a spiritual psychotic break. This was not premeditated murder. This was a father discovering the impossible. A man of God who unknowingly lay with his own child and broke. But the jury wasn't buying it. They watched the security footage. They saw the pattern of obsession in his journals. They heard how he'd taken DNA samples behind her back. And they listened to witnesses, congregants who described Ezekiel growing more erratic, paranoid, and consumed with divine justice. Then came Ezekiel's turn on the stand. He stood tall, calm, cold. "I did not kill Mirabelle because she was transgender," he said. "I killed her because she was my son, and I loved her in a way I never should have. That's a stain I can't wash off. That's a sin that no baptism can cleanse." The courtroom went silent. Some gasped, some wept, and others clapped. The jury deliberated for nearly 20 hours. When they returned, the room was still. Guilty. First-degree murder. 30 years in state prison. No chance of parole. Ezekiel didn't blink. But outside the courtroom, America was tearing itself apart. Some hailed him as a tragic figure, a victim of deception and a world gone morally bankrupt. Others called him what he was, a murderer, a monster, a warning of what happens when blind faith is weaponized against truth. Mirabelle was buried in a quiet cemetery outside Mobile. No family, no funeral. Her tombstone read, "She just wanted to be seen." And even now, years later, people still ask, was it murder? Was it madness? Or was it just the inevitable result? When truth meets faith and one doesn't survive, they don't call him pastor anymore. Inside the walls of St. Clair Correctional Facility, he's just inmate number 881206, a number stamped on an orange jumpsuit, assigned to a bunk near the back of Unit C. His days are quiet now. No sermons, no followers, no choir singing behind him. Just the hum of fluorescent lights, the clang of metal doors, and the heavy silence of men who have nothing left to say. Ezekiel Graves spends most of his time alone. No one sits next to him in the cafeteria. No one joins him in the yard. He isn't feared, just avoided. Even among thieves, killers, and addicts, there's something about his crime that feels untouchable. Too intimate, too confusing, too human. Some inmates whisper, "He's the preacher who married his own son." Others spit the word pervert or abomination. He doesn't flinch. He just keeps his head down and pushes his food around his tray. But every night, after lights out, when the noise of the prison dies down to a dull, rhythmic hum, Ezekiel opens a notebook, cheap, lined, prison issue, and begins to write. The first page reads, "To the child I lost, and the woman I never really knew." He writes the way he once preached, carefully, with purpose. Not for redemption, not for forgiveness, but for memory. "You love dinosaurs," one entry reads. "Not the cartoon ones, the real ones. You used to tell me the names I could never pronounce, and I pretended I understood. You draw them on the back of my sermon notes during church. I get mad, but now I'd give anything to see one of your messy little sketches again. I hated the word transgender, not because I didn't understand it, but because deep down I was afraid I did. I was afraid it would bring you back, and it did, and I wasn't ready. You looked so much like your mother when you cried. I wish I had told you that. I wish I'd held you when you came back, instead of trying to cleanse you with punishment. He never shares these writings. He never mails them. He knows there's no one left to receive them. But still, he writes, because in a world where he no longer has a pulpit, a family, or a future, memory is the only thing that listens. Once a month, a young chaplain visits the prison to offer spiritual counsel. Most inmates ignore him. But one day, the chaplain approached Ezekiel. Mind if I sit? He asked. Ezekiel shrugged. Do what you feel led to. The chaplain smiled. You used to say that in your sermons, didn't you? Ezekiel chuckled dryly. Yeah, I used to say a lot of things. After a long silence, the chaplain leaned forward. Do you still believe in God? Ezekiel stared at the concrete wall for a long time before answering. I believe he's there, he said, but I also believe he's quiet now. Not because he's punishing me, but because he already told me everything I needed to hear, and I didn't listen. The chaplain didn't push. As he left, Ezekiel returned to his notebook, flipped to a fresh page, and wrote, You didn't come back to punish me. You came back to be loved, and I failed you twice. Behind bars, Ezekiel Graves isn't a pastor. He isn't even a murderer. He's just a father, haunted by the memory of a child who came home and found no room left at the altar. 10 years passed. The world moved on. True crime podcasts faded. Documentaries were replaced by new scandals. And the headlines that once rocked the nation were buried beneath newer outrage. But behind the concrete walls of St. Clair Correctional, Ezekiel Graves continued to wake up every day at 5 a.m., kneel beside his bunk, and pray. Not for freedom, not for forgiveness, but for understanding. He no longer asked why God had allowed it all to happen. He stopped begging for the weight to be lifted. Now, he simply whispered the same line each morning. Show me what's left to love. One spring afternoon, a journalism student from the University of Alabama was granted permission to interview him for a thesis on faith and moral collapse in American prisons. She was young, 22, nervous, but curious. She asked all the usual questions about the trial, the murder, the scandal. But before she left, she asked one more. Do you think your faith survived all of this? Ezekiel paused, then smiled just slightly. It wasn't peace, but wasn't torment either. I think faith is like a stained glass window, he said. Oh, it tells a story. But when it breaks, it doesn't disappear. The light still comes through, just in different shapes. As the young woman packed her notes, Ezekiel pulled out a folded piece of paper from his Bible. On it was a sketch, crude but careful, of a dinosaur. A child's drawing, preserved for decades. He held it out to her. My daughter drew that, he said, back when she was still my son. She didn't take it. She just nodded, eyes glassy, and walked away in silence. Back in his cell, Ezekiel tucked the drawing away, returned to his bunk, and stared up at the ceiling. Somewhere, in the cracks of that broken faith, something still flickered. Not grace, not justice, but something harder to name and maybe more holy.